Hey folks, this is Rhykker with another Diablo lore video. Yep, it's finally happening. In this episode, we discuss the reign of terror that befell the town of Tristram and the three heroes that came to save the town. This is part 12 in a video series where we explore all the major players in the story of Diablo, from the Nephilim to Tyrael to Deckard Kane to Diablo himself. And we give a crash course on what exactly is going on story-wise in this game series. Feel free to check out our previous episodes if you haven't, and be sure to have subscription notifications turned on for when a new episode comes out eventually. In our last episode, we discussed how the most tragic character in all of Diablo's lore, King Leoric, was driven to madness and slain, all because of the trickery of his trickster advisor, Archbishop Lazarus. Today's episode will effectively cover the story of Diablo 1, the events leading up to it all the way to the final boss. But before we dive into this episode, a quick word from this video's sponsor along with an announcement. I built my website Rykker.com using Squarespace, and I was able to do everything myself, quickly and easily and with zero education in the field, all thanks to how easy Squarespace is to work with. And now I've built a section on my site where you can find all of my Diablo lore videos, along with quick synopses of each episode. Watch how easily I make this update. Squarespace is flexible for any kind of website, whether for your business or your hobby, with tons of templates that you can easily customize to your needs with no knowledge of coding needed. You can even connect your social media profiles to automatically push website content to your socials, and set up members-only areas with exclusive content. Basically, if you want to build a website, I recommend Squarespace. So, head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Rhykker and use code Rhykker to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. That's squarespace.com/RHYKKER and use code Rhykker to get started today. As we left off, Leoric had just been killed after his youngest son, Prince Albric, had been brought down into the depths of the cathedral beneath the town of Tristram, where Diablo took possession of the young boy. And while the people of Tristram may have thought that their troubles were over with the Mad King lying dead, little did they know that Diablo had only begun to spread his influence. Villagers began disappearing. Strange lights and horrible screams of anguish were seen and heard from the cathedral. And no, it wasn't just a rowdy house party. At that point, a lot of people started to nope the hell out of Tristram, with only a few choosing to remain, some because they simply couldn't afford to leave. It was at this point that Lazarus emerged from the cathedral, looking all ragged and haggard, and he claimed to the townsfolk, "Guys, I too was totally possessed by Diablo, just like Leoric. But I'm good now. I got better. So, don't blame me for any of the horrible things that I did. I'm a good guy now, trust me. Oh, also, let's not forget that some jerk kidnapped Prince Albric and took him down to the cathedral. We gotta go save him. Let's go do that right now." And not necessarily because they're a bunch of suckers, but because Lazarus did have a point about the prince, a bunch of townsfolk responded to the call of heroism and banded together like a way too big Dungeons & Dragons party to dive into the dungeon and rescue the child. However, unlike most, but not all, Dungeons & Dragons parties, the cleric was a traitor. Lazarus led them straight into a trap, an ambush of demons led by a particularly bloodthirsty demon known as the Butcher. Y'all know what happens next. Now, let's talk about the Butcher for a moment before we discuss the fate of those poor would-be heroes. Butcher demons are a type of demon that exist in hell that are created with foul magic by stitching together parts of other demons to combine their strengths. Kind of like a horrible, evil Build-A-Bear. This particular Butcher demon gained notoriety for being sent to Tristram to serve Diablo's will, and he got the honor of becoming known as the Butcher, rather than just a Butcher, or say, Bill the Butcher. Now, the Butcher's weapon of choice was a cleaver the size of an axe, which would leave wounds that would fester with disease, as the poor Tristram townsfolk who survived the Butcher would soon find out. And thankfully, or not, there were a few survivors, one of whom was Farnham, every Diablo 1 player's favorite drunk, although he goes from comic relief drunk to sad, depressing drunk real fast when you realize he only became a drunk after he escaped from the Butcher, because the ordeal just completely shattered his spirit. After his escape, Farnham spent most of his time at the Tavern of the Rising Sun, owned by Ogden, getting drunker and drunker every night. The tavern itself served as a point of light for the people of Tristram during the dark times that began with King Leoric's gradual descent into madness. Now, normally Ogden was a responsible tavern owner that would not encourage someone's alcoholism, but he couldn't bring himself to ask Farnham to leave, knowing what the poor man had been through and that a cup of grog was pretty much the only thing keeping him from completely falling to pieces, as opposed to just mostly falling to pieces. Someone Ogden did try to convince to leave, however, was the young barmaid Gillian, who was something of a surrogate daughter to him. See, Gillian grew up in Tristram and lost her mother at a young age. She was just left with her grandmother, who was ill. Ogden gave Gillian a job at his tavern and let her and her sick grandmother live there. But when terrible things started happening in Tristram and Gillian began to suffer horrible nightmares, Ogden begged the teenage Gillian to leave the town. But Gillian said her grandmother was too sick to travel, so Ogden promised that he'd take care of her grandma. But still, Gillian refused, at least for now. We'll talk more about Gillian and her greater role in Diablo's story in a future episode. Gillian had grown up with a woman named Canis, whose child Wirt was one of the villagers abducted and brought down into the cathedral. Canis died of grief, and though young Wirt was actually saved during the incursion into the cathedral, he became mean-spirited, with a darkness forever hanging over him. Though he took a job as a stable boy at the Tavern of the Rising Sun, the kid became a shady hustler, a smuggler and a peddler, trying to pawn garbage off onto travelers in order to get rich. But who could blame the kid for turning to the dark side after being tortured by demons and losing his mom? Oh, and did I mention he also lost his leg? Yeah, it was gnawed off by demons. The town healer, Pepin, could do nothing to bring Wirt's leg back, so he attached the wooden peg leg that would become famous for opening the secret cow level in Diablo 2. Pepin, a man in his mid-60s, used to be a high-ranking priest who served under Archbishop Lazarus, but after he saw Leoric and Lazarus succumbing to corruption, he decided to hide out in Tristram and make his home there. Big mistake. Should have picked literally anywhere else. Now, Wirt escaped because he was saved by Griswold, the town blacksmith. Griswold had spent most of his life in smith work, and he studied and labored for years to create the perfect sword. Sadly, he never got to craft the sword himself. He made a number of attempts throughout his life, including Griswold's Edge, an item you find in Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, but Griswold's masterpiece, his crowning achievement, was crafted post-mortem by other blacksmiths and found in Diablo 3. But in life, Griswold's greatest act of heroism was diving into the cathedral along with other Tristram villagers. He fought valiantly, using his brute force, his strength, muscles that he'd built up from decades of blacksmithing, hammering away at that anvil. He was in his 40s at the time of the incursion into the cathedral, and he actually managed to kill a number of demons and rescue Wirt before he himself suffered a leg injury that would never fully heal and prevent him from ever fighting again. And then he himself would not have escaped because of his injury, and it was thanks to Farnham the Drunk, or the not yet drunk, that Griswold managed to escape with that wounded leg. So let's see, by now we've spoken about Farnham the Drunk, we've spoken about Gillian the Barmaid, Griswold the Blacksmith, Ogden the Tavern Keeper, Wirt the Peg-Leg Boy, and Pepin the Healer. That's just about every NPC you can interact with in Diablo 1. There are just two others we haven't spoken about yet: Adria the Witch and Deckard Kane. We're getting real close to the events of Diablo 1, folks. Now, there's a lot to say about Adria, but we'll save her story for a future episode. For now, we'll say that Adria the Witch arrived while most people were fleeing Tristram. Most of the villagers were wary of her since, you know, superstition and prejudice. She's a witch, burn her, that kind of thing. Deckard Kane was pretty much the only person who would talk to her, and they spent many nights in the Tavern of the Rising Sun comparing notes on Diablo lore. As for Deckard Kane, the man who needs almost no introduction, well, his story begins with a fellow named Jared Kane, who you may remember us talking about in our previous episode about the Horadrim. You can find that one right here for a refresher, but the Horadrim were an ancient order of mages and wizards formed by the Archangel Tyrael to fight the three primevals. Jared Kane was a Viserai mage, and he was the second leader of the Horadrim. After generations, and as the Horadrim faded away, one of Jared Kane's descendants, a woman named Adaris Kane, lived in Tristram and married a tanner whom she had a son with. She named this son Deckard Kane, and while it was customary for the father's surname to be passed on, she insisted that he keep the name Kane. As she aged, Adaris Kane would tell the children of the village stories about the Horadrim, stories that became increasingly extravagant with each retelling, stories that seemed like fairy tales to the children of the small village. So Kane grew up with all these stories, and he considered himself as a young child, proud to be, as his mother put it, the last Haradrim. As a kid, he imagined himself to grow up to be a hero that would travel the world and fight evil. However, by age 11, when his father died of illness, Kane felt he had outgrown his mother's stories. He no longer believed them to be true, and thought his mom was just going senile. Angels, demons, none of this stuff exists, right? Just mom and her crazy stories. This was probably aided by Deckard's rising interest in history, as his research into scholarly history books did not seem to corroborate his mother's fairy tales. So when she burnt his history books and insisted that the only books he should be reading were those written by Deckard Kane, that pretty much was the end of their relationship. As an adult, Kane served as a schoolmaster and a storyteller in Tristram. However, it was quite difficult for him to find people within the small village who shared his love of books. Stay a while and... stay a while. Kane eventually married a woman named Amelia, and together they had a child whom they named Jared. In case you're not doing the math, that's the name of Deckard Kane, honored Haradric ancestor. And yet, Deckard Kane isn't supposed to believe in those silly stories anymore, right? Well, his wife wondered about that as well, and this was part of what created tensions between the two. That and the fact that Deckard, sadly, wasn't a very good husband or father. He became increasingly absorbed in his work and scholarly pursuits, spending less and less time with his wife and child. He missed little Jared's first words, his first steps. He wasn't even there for the boy when a fever nearly killed him. Jillian spent more time with Jared than Deckard did, as the two were kids and grew up together. So Kane and Amelia fought more and more over the years until, when Kane was 35 years old, they had the biggest fight in their marriage, and Amelia took little Jared and left Tristram. The plan was to head east and go live with Amelia's mother. Unfortunately, they never made it. On the road, they were accosted by robbers and killed. Pepin the healer, who was a close friend of Deckard Kane, was the one to hand Deckard the letter that informed Kane about the death of his wife and kid. Deckard didn't take it well, and their deaths would haunt him for the rest of his life, which, as we know, was many decades. But Kane found something of a surrogate son in Prince Aiden, the first son of King Leoric, who we haven't really spoken about yet, whom Kane was tasked with tutoring. Kane came to love Aiden like a son, perhaps the way he should have loved Jared, because he was forced to spend time with him and bond with him. When Leoric sent his army to war with Westmarch, he sent Prince Aiden as well, as a young soldier. As Deckard Kane saw Leoric increasingly descend into madness, and spooky, awful things start to happen around Tristram, he started thinking about the stories his mom had told him as a kid. Maybe there was some truth to these tales of evil entities. So he sought out old Haradric text inside Tristram Cathedral. This is before Diablo took it over and turned it into spooky land. And Kane realized that these texts spoke about angels and demons, not like they were some kind of myth, but actual history. Fast forward to demons pouring out of Tristram Cathedral and abducting villagers, and Kane realized that his mom was right all along, as mothers so often are. While he felt bad for being such a douchebag to his mom in his youth, this realization gave him a new sense of purpose. He would spread the wisdom of the Haradrim to anyone who would listen, without clicking and skipping past his dialogue, in order to arm them with the knowledge to defeat the forces of evil. Because as we all know, knowing is half the battle. Diablo! Now, it was after Adria's arrival in Tristram that adventurers started to show up, either to try to fight the demons within the monastery or to simply go on magic find runs searching for loot. Kane deemed most of them unworthy of the title hero, and they met their untimely demise within the cathedral. Unlike hardcore characters, their deeds of valor would not be remembered. Amidst the other adventurers and would-be heroes, Farnham the Drunk made many attempts to return to the depths of the cathedral as his daughter had been abducted, and against all odds, he managed to sneak in, find her, and get out with her. Unfortunately, the girl had been severely wounded, and not even Pepin the healer could save her. It was around this time that Prince Aiden returned from the failed campaign in Westmarch. He and Deckard Kane saw Farnham and his daughter, and knowing that the daughter could not be saved, and worse, that she actually may turn into an undead creature due to the evil powers at work, Deckard Kane led Farnham away so that Aiden can do the unpleasant job of giving Farnham's daughter peace. Kane was proud to see that Aiden had become a man throughout his time away, a man worthy of the title hero. Aiden vowed to rescue his little brother, and at Kane's urging, he took with him 2 others who had come to investigate the terrors beneath Tristram, Morena the rogue, and Jazreth the sorcerer. In case it hasn't clicked yet, this is our trio of playable characters in Diablo 1, Aiden the warrior, the rogue, and the sorcerer. Morena was a member of the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye, carrying with her a bow named the Raven's Wing, which we find in Diablo 3. Morena was sent by the Sisterhood to investigate Tristram, along with a group of rogues that she led. We'll talk more about this Sisterhood in the future. As for Jazreth, he was a member of the Vigerai, a mage clan that we've spoken about before. The Vigerai sent many of its members to investigate Tristram, to both seek out the source of evil, as well as discover any long-lost tomes of magical knowledge along the way. Together, the trio ventured into the cathedral. They defeated the Butcher,
fresh meat,
and then Aiden came face to face, or face to skull, I guess, with his father, King Leoric, who had now become the Skeleton King. It was hard on Aiden, but the trio managed to vanquish the Skeleton King and put Leoric to rest once and for all. Right? I mean, surely that's the last of Leoric, right? Surely this is the end of this tragic character's misery? He's not gonna have to suffer anymore? Oh. The trio continued to slay their way deeper and deeper into the cathedral, eventually reaching the unholy altar where they found the treacherous Archbishop Lazarus and a young boy who had just been sacrificed, whom the trio originally believed to be Albric. They killed Lazarus and confirmed that the body was not that of Aiden's brother. Oh, phew, what a relief. It's just some other poor innocent child. After they reported back to Deckard Kane, who confirmed to them that the next threat they'd have to face was Diablo himself, they proceeded deeper into the cathedral, and Aiden described the final level as the threshold of hell itself. Not only did they have to fight demons, but the influence of Diablo's terror made Aiden relive his worst nightmares, his greatest failures, and his fears that he'd never live up to his father's expectations. How could I fail that spelling bee? I know address has 2 D's. Stupid, stupid. But believing he could still save his brother, Aiden fought through it all, and with the trio's combined forces, they managed to wear Diablo down. Aiden struck the final blow. He pulled the soulstone shard out of Diablo's skull, only to see Diablo's corpse transform back into the body of his little brother. He went in thinking this was a rescue mission, thinking he had to defeat Diablo to find his brother, not knowing that by killing Diablo, he was also finishing off what remained of his brother. Now, Kane had armed Aiden with knowledge of the Soulstones, and Aiden could see that it was but a broken shard that had been driven into his brother. He correctly surmised that this broken piece was not strong enough to contain Diablo forever, but he thought he was strong enough to suppress Diablo's will. So Aiden drove the Soulstone shard into his own forehead. An eerie red glow blurred Aiden's vision. He began to hear the tormented whispers of the damned, and he can feel Diablo trying to claw his way out of his prison, but they had done it. The essence of Diablo was contained. For now. But what would happen to Aiden and his 2 new companions? What's the deal with Adria the Witch? Will nothing bad ever happen again to Tristram? All these questions and more will be answered as we continue to explore this Diablo lore series. Stay tuned. Until then, be sure to get caught up on past episodes, which you can now find on Rhykker.com. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon, and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Diablo content.